Welcome, friends. Tonight, we're going on a journey. A long, quiet, respectful journey across this country and beyond, visiting the final resting places of 50 famous people we've lost just recently. Some of these names you'll know the moment you hear them. Others might surprise you. All of them left a mark on the world, and all of them have a story worth telling one more time. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. We start in the rolling Virginia countryside, about an hour west of Washington, in a place called Middleburg. It's horse country out here, stone fences, green pastures, the kind of land that looks like it belongs in a painting. And it's here, on a quiet farm he loved deeply, that Robert Duvall spent his final years. Duvall died peacefully at home on February 15, 2026, at the age of 95. No official cause of death was ever announced. His wife, Luciana, simply said he passed surrounded by love and comfort and asked for privacy. Now, if you're of a certain age, Robert Duvall is woven into just about every great American film you've ever seen. He was Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird back in 1962, his very first film role, and he barely said a word. He didn't need to. Then came Tom Hagen, the quiet, careful consigliere to the Corleone family in The Godfather, and its sequel. He was Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore in Apocalypse Now, the man who loved the smell of napalm in the morning. And then there was the role that won him the Academy Award for Best Actor, Max Sledge, a washed-up country singer trying to rebuild his life in the 1983 film Tender Mercies. Duvall did his own singing in that picture, and if you haven't seen it, you owe it to yourself. Over his career, he received 7 Oscar nominations in all, and he won 2 Emmy Awards as well, including one for the beloved miniseries Lonesome Dove, playing the unforgettable Augustus McCrae alongside Tommy Lee Jones. That was the role Duvall himself called his favorite. He once said that Gus McCrae was so authentic that Texas ranchers told him they knew men exactly like the character. Here's a detail you might not know. Duvall studied acting at the Neighborhood Playhouse in New York under the legendary teacher Sanford Meisner, and his classmates there included 2 other future legends, Gene Hackman and Dustin Hoffman. Duvall and Hoffman once shared a tiny New York apartment while they were both broke and trying to find work, and Hackman was right there with them, clerking at Macy's to pay the rent. All 3 became giants of the screen. Hackman, whom we'll visit later on this tour, died just months before Duvall in 2025. 2 members of the same acting class, gone within a year. And one more thing about Duvall. He met his 4th wife, Luciana, on a trip to Argentina. He told Esquire that the flower shop was closed, so he went to the bakery instead. And if the flower shop had been open, he never would have met her. He was 74 at the time. They were married for 20 years, and she was by his side at the end. He never had children, but he had one of the richest careers any actor has ever lived. From the gentle hills of Virginia, let's head to the Windy City. In Chicago's Greater Grand Crossing neighborhood sits Oakwood Cemetery, one of the largest cemeteries on the South Side. It's a place of tremendous historical weight. Ida B. Wells is buried here, and so is Jesse Owens, the track and field hero who stood up to Hitler at the 1936 Olympics. Former Chicago Mayor Harold Washington rests here too. And now, laid among them, is the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Jackson died on February 17, 2026, at the age of 84. He had been battling progressive supranuclear palsy, a rare neurological disorder that gradually robbed him of his ability to move and speak in his later years. His funeral at Chicago's House of Hope Church was a 5-hour affair that drew 3 former presidents, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, and Joe Biden, along with thousands of mourners. Stevie Wonder performed. Jennifer Hudson sang. It was a homegoing service befitting a man who had spent 60 years on the national stage. Jesse Jackson was born in Greenville, South Carolina in 1941 and became one of the most visible civil rights leaders in American history. He was a protege of Martin Luther King Jr. and was standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis on April 3, 1968, the day before King was assassinated. That experience shaped everything that followed. Jackson founded the Rainbow Push Coalition in Chicago and became the voice of a broad, multiracial movement for justice and economic opportunity. In 1984, and again in 1988, he ran for the presidency, the first African American to mount a truly competitive campaign for the Democratic nomination. He didn't win, but he registered millions of new voters and expanded the party's tent. His rallying cry, "Keep Hope Alive," became one of the most recognizable phrases in American public life. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Clinton in 2000. In later years, Jackson was also an international negotiator, successfully securing the release of American hostages in Syria, Cuba, and the former Yugoslavia. His son, Jesse Jr., now leads the Rainbow Push Coalition. Let's travel west now, all the way to the Hawaiian Islands, where one of the most unlikely action heroes in Hollywood history spent his final days. Chuck Norris, born Carlos Ray Norris in Ryan, Oklahoma, population about 700, died on March 19, 2026, surrounded by his family in Hawaii. He was 86. Now, Chuck Norris became a cultural phenomenon not once but twice over. The first time was through sheer grit and discipline. He learned martial arts while serving in the United States Air Force in South Korea, came back stateside, opened a chain of karate schools with celebrity clients, and dominated tournaments throughout the 1960s. He won the International Karate Championship in 1967. Along the way, he befriended a young martial artist named Bruce Lee. Lee cast Norris as his opponent in Way of the Dragon in 1972. And that famous fight scene in the Roman Colosseum made Norris a star in the martial arts world. He turned that reputation into a string of action films throughout the 80s, Missing in Action, Lone Wolf McQuade, Code of Silence. And then, in 1993, came the role that cemented his place in every American living room, Cordell Walker on the CBS series Walker, Texas Ranger. The show ran for 9 seasons and was watched faithfully by millions. And then Chuck Norris became famous all over again, this time through the internet. The Chuck Norris facts memes swept across early internet culture in the mid-2000s. Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups. He pushes the earth down. Chuck Norris counted to infinity, twice. He took it all in good humor and became, improbably, one of the most beloved figures in American pop culture for an entirely new generation. His family said in their statement that he was at peace. Before he was an actor, a martial artist, or an internet legend, he was a shy boy from a tiny Oklahoma town. It was martial arts that gave him confidence. "I didn't have the greatest athletic ability," he once said, "but I had a dream." From the Pacific back to the mainland. On January 30th, 2026, the comedy world lost one of its most gifted and distinctive performers when Catherine O'Hara died at her home in the Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles. She was 71. The cause was later revealed to be a pulmonary embolism with rectal cancer, a diagnosis she had kept entirely private, as the underlying cause. She was cremated, and her remains were given to her husband, production designer Bo Welch, whom she had met on the set of Beetlejuice back in 1988. Catherine O'Hara was Canadian-born, raised in Toronto, the 6th of 7 children. She got her start as an understudy for Gilda Radner at the Second City Theatre in the mid-70s, and became a star on the sketch comedy show SCTV alongside Eugene Levy. She won her first Emmy for writing on that program. Then came a string of roles that put her face in every American household. The eccentric, spiritually possessed Delia in Tim Burton's Beetlejuice. The frantic, regretful mother, Kate McAllister, in the first 2 Home Alone movies, a role that generations of children watched every holiday season. And a series of pitch-perfect performances in Christopher Guest's mockumentary films, Best in Show, Waiting for Guffman, A Mighty Wind. She voiced Sally in The Nightmare Before Christmas, a role she reprised for decades of Halloween celebrations at Disneyland. But the role that earned her the deepest love came later in life. Starting in 2015, she played the magnificently self-absorbed, wig-wearing, vocabulary-mangling Moira Rose on Schitt's Creek, a performance so funny and so precisely calibrated that it won her a second Emmy and a Golden Globe. She was 70 years old and at the peak of her powers. She was still working right up until the end, starring in Seth Rogen's Apple TV series The Studio, for which she won a posthumous Screen Actors Guild Award, the first woman ever to win an individual SAG award after death. Here's something that always delighted fans who learned it. O'Hara had dextrocardia with situs inversus, a rare condition in which the heart and other major internal organs are mirror-reversed from their normal positions. She carried her heart on the right side of her chest her entire life. On the very same day Catherine O'Hara died, January 30th, 2026, another familiar face from 70s television also passed away. Demond Wilson, who played Lamont Sanford on the hit NBC sitcom Sanford and Son, died at his home in Palm Springs from complications of prostate cancer. He was 79. If you watched television in the 1970s, you knew Demond Wilson's face as well as you knew your own family's. He was the put-upon, exasperated son trying to make something of his life, while his father, played by the great Red Fox, faked heart attacks, called him a big dummy, and hollered at him from the junkyard on South Central Avenue. The show was based on the British comedy Steptoe and Son and was a top 10 hit in 5 of its 6 seasons. It broke important ground as one of the first prime-time shows with a predominantly black cast. Wilson got the role after a guest appearance on All in the Family, where he and Cleavon Little played burglars who held the Bunker family hostage. Producers Norman Lear and Bud Yorkin saw that episode and knew they'd found their Lamont. Wilson beat out Richard Pryor for the part. "I said, 'You can't put a comedian with a comedian,'" Wilson recalled. "You've got to have a straight man." Here's what many people didn't know about Demond Wilson. He was a Vietnam veteran who served with the Army's 4th Infantry Division before his acting career. And after Hollywood, he became an ordained Pentecostal minister, spending decades preaching and writing books. Wilson and Fox had a famously complicated relationship. They hadn't spoken since 1977 when Fox walked off the show in a salary dispute. Wilson learned about it from a newscaster in the hallway at NBC. He wrote about all of it in his 2009 memoir, Second Banana. Despite the distance between them, Wilson always spoke of Fox with respect. "We were making history," he once said. "We were the first blacks to be on television in that capacity, and we opened the door for all those other shows." Let's shift from television to music now and head north to the San Francisco Bay Area. Bob Weir, a founding member of the Grateful Dead, died on January 10, 2026, at the age of 78. His daughter Chloe confirmed that he passed peacefully, surrounded by loved ones. He had beaten cancer the previous summer but succumbed to underlying lung problems that had worsened in the months that followed. Bob Weir was just 17 years old when he teamed up with Jerry Garcia, Phil Lesh, Bill Kreutzmann, and Ron Pigpen McKernan in Palo Alto in 1965 to form the band that would become the Grateful Dead. He was the little brother of the group, the youngest member, the rhythm guitarist, the harmony singer who stood stage right and held down the groove. For 30 years, through thousands of concerts and the entire psychedelic era, and far beyond it, Weir was there. The Dead played more live shows than virtually any other major rock band in history, and their fans, the Deadheads, followed them from city to city in a traveling community, unlike anything else in American culture. When Garcia died in 1995, many thought the Dead were finished. But Weir carried the torch forward, forming bands like Rat Dog and, most recently, Dead & Company, keeping the music alive for a whole new generation of fans. His death came just 2 years after bassist Phil Lesh passed, meaning that none of the original 5 members of the Grateful Dead now survive. The Dead weren't just a band. They were a philosophy, a community, a way of life. And Weir, the quiet one, the steady one, was at the center of it all for 60 years. If you ever saw him perform, even in his 70s, you know the man never once looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. from one kind of music to another entirely. In late February 2026, the world said goodbye to Neil Sedaka, the Brooklyn-born singer and songwriter responsible for some of the catchiest pop tunes ever to come out of a radio. Sedaka died on February 27, 2026, at the age of 86. If you turned on a radio between 1958 and 1963, you heard Neil Sedaka, "Oh, Carol," written for his real-life high school sweetheart, a girl named Carol King, who went to Abraham Lincoln High School in Brooklyn, right alongside him, and would go on to become one of the great songwriters in her own right. Calendar Girl, Happy Birthday Sweet 16, and of course, Breaking Up Is Hard to Do, which hit number 1 in 1962 with its bouncy, irresistible doo-doo-doo-down, doobie-doo-down-down opening. In a remarkable feat, that same song charted again in 1975, this time in a slower, more wistful arrangement that gave it entirely new emotional depth. Sedaka was a classically trained pianist who attended the Juilliard School of Music. He composed songs not only for himself but for dozens of other artists, and he was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1983, earning 5 Grammy nominations over his career. Here's a fun detail. Before going solo, Sedaka was a founding member of a doo-wop group called The Tokens. He left the group before they recorded their biggest hit, The Lion Sleeps Tonight, one of those what-if moments in music. You have to wonder whether he ever thought about that one on a quiet evening. Now let's cross the country to Utah, where one of cinema's greatest leading men chose to spend his final years at the place that bore his most famous character's name. Robert Redford died on September 16, 2025, at his home in Sundance, in the mountains outside Provo. He was 89. His publicist confirmed he passed peacefully, surrounded by those he loved. Robert Redford was the golden boy of American cinema for decades. Those blue eyes, that sun-streaked hair, he looked like he'd been designed by a Hollywood prop department. But the man behind the face was far more interesting than any pretty boy label could contain. He starred in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with Paul Newman, in The Sting, in The Way We Were with Barbra Streisand, in All the President's Men with Dustin Hoffman, in The Natural, in Out of Africa. Then he stepped behind the camera and won the Academy Award for directing Ordinary People in 1980, a film about the quiet devastation of an American family after a tragedy, as far from a golden boy movie as you could get. But what truly set Redford apart was what he built off-screen. He co-founded what became the Sundance Film Festival in the late 1970s and later created the Sundance Institute, giving independent filmmakers a launching pad that transformed the entire industry. Before Sundance, there was almost no path for a young director without studio connections. After Sundance, a whole universe of independent cinema opened up. Quentin Tarantino, Steven Soderbergh, the Coen brothers. All of them came through the world that Redford helped create. Before he was a movie star, Redford had studied art in Europe and worked on oil rigs, experiences that informed his lifelong environmentalism. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, an honorary Oscar, and the Kennedy Center honors. He spent his final years quietly at the one place in the world that meant the most to him. Now let's take a detour into haute couture. On January 19, 2026, the legendary Italian designer Valentino Garavani died at the age of 93. Known to the entire world simply as Valentino, he was one of the defining figures of 20th century fashion. Valentino founded his fashion house in Rome in 1960 and soared to international prominence when Jacqueline Kennedy began wearing his designs after President Kennedy's assassination. From that moment on, Valentino dressed some of the most famous women in the world: Elizabeth Taylor, Sophia Loren, Julia Roberts, who wore his black and white vintage gown to the 2001 Academy Awards. His signature was Valentino Red, a very specific shade of crimson that he said he discovered as a young man attending the opera in Barcelona. He saw that color in the costumes and the curtains and the flowers, and he decided it would be his. And it was. Even people who knew nothing about fashion recognized that shade of red. He retired from his label in 2008 and made a memorable cameo in The Devil Wears Prada. He spent his later years surrounded by art, pugs, he was famous for his pugs, and the kind of effortless Italian elegance that takes a lifetime to cultivate. Back to the screen now, and a face that defined a generation of moviegoers. Diane Keaton died on October 11, 2025, at the age of 79 from bacterial pneumonia at a hospital in Santa Monica, California. Diane Keaton was unlike anyone else who ever worked in Hollywood. In her trademark bowler hats, oversized blazers, men's neckties, and tinted glasses, she was instantly recognizable. And she'd been dressing that way long before it was fashionable to have what people now call a personal style. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress in Woody Allen's Annie Hall in 1977, playing the charming, scattered, utterly original Annie, a character so closely modeled on Keaton herself that Allen used her real last name. She was born Diane Hall. She took the stage name Keaton from her mother's maiden name. Beyond Annie Hall, she was Kay Adams in all 3 Godfather films, the outsider drawn helplessly into the Corleone family's darkness. She sparkled opposite Steve Martin in the Father of the Bride films and earned 3 more Oscar nominations over her career, for Reds, Marvin's Room, and Something's Gotta Give. She received the American Film Institute Life Achievement Award in 2017. One detail that captures her perfectly: she was a member of the original Broadway cast of the musical Hair in 1968, and she famously refused to appear nude on stage, even though the show's notorious nude scene was a defining feature. That stubborn individualism, funny, warm, absolutely unyielding when it came to her own principles, was what made Diane Keaton irreplaceable. Gene Hackman, her Godfather co-star, died just months before her, and Robert Duvall, another co-star from those films, followed in February 2026. The Godfather cast was losing its members one by one. Speaking of Gene Hackman, let's visit him now. Hackman died in late February 2025 at his home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He was 95. The circumstances of his passing were unusual and widely reported. Hackman and his wife Betsy were both found dead in their home by maintenance workers. It was later determined that Betsy had died from a respiratory condition roughly 2 weeks earlier, and Gene from severe cardiovascular disease, with Alzheimer's as a significant contributing factor. Gene Hackman was one of the most thrilling actors who ever stepped in front of a camera. He won 2 Academy Awards for The French Connection, playing the profane, morally complicated New York narcotics detective Popeye Doyle in one of the grittiest films of the 70s, and for Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood's brutal revisionist western in which Hackman played a sadistic frontier sheriff. He earned 3 more nominations for Bonnie and Clyde, I Never Sang for My Father, and Mississippi Burning. And then there were the roles that every moviegoer remembers without needing to check a list. Lex Luthor in the Christopher Reeve Superman films, played with a wicked theatrical relish, the inspirational small-town basketball coach in Hoosiers, the eccentric patriarch Royal Tenenbaum in Wes Anderson's film, the surveillance expert in The Conversation. Hackman retired from acting after 2004 and spent 2 decades living quietly, writing Western novels with a co-author, painting, and staying as far from the spotlight as a 2-time Oscar winner could manage. He once said he'd never been comfortable with fame, and he proved it by walking away from Hollywood entirely, on his own terms. He and Robert Duvall had been friends since their student days together in New York in the 1950s. Duvall once said that Hackman was the finest actor he ever worked alongside. Now for a change of pace, from the intensity of the screen to the intensity of a Saturday afternoon in the fall. Lou Holtz, one of the most successful and charismatic coaches in the history of college football, died on March 4, 2026, at the age of 88. Holtz cemented his place in the sport by leading the Notre Dame Fighting Irish to a national championship in 1988, an undefeated season that remains one of the proudest chapters in that university's storied athletic tradition. Over the course of his career, Holtz served as head coach at 6 different schools: William and Mary, North Carolina State, Arkansas, Minnesota, Notre Dame, and South Carolina. He was the only coach in NCAA history to lead 6 different programs to bowl games. He was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in 2008. But beyond the wins and losses, Lou Holtz was beloved as a motivational speaker of enormous energy and humor. He was a compact man, maybe 5'10" on a good day, with a pronounced lisp and a grin that lit up any room he entered. After retiring from coaching, he became an analyst on ESPN, where a whole new audience fell in love with his enthusiasm and rapid-fire one-liners. "I never learn anything talking," he once said. "I only learn things when I ask questions." He also said, "In this world, you're either growing or you're dying, so get in motion and grow." Coaches came and went, but Holtz remained a presence in the sport he loved right up until the end. From the gridiron to the rock stage. In early February 2026, fans of the band Three Doors Down were stunned by the death of their founding lead singer, Brad Arnold, at the age of 47. Arnold had been battling stage 4 kidney cancer, a diagnosis he shared publicly months earlier. Arnold formed Three Doors Down in Escatawpa, Mississippi in 1996, and the band crashed onto the national scene with their debut single, Kryptonite, in 2000. That song shot to #1 on the modern rock chart and introduced Arnold's muscular, deeply emotive vocals to millions of listeners. The band followed up with a string of hits: When I'm Gone, Here Without You, It's Not My Time, and Let Me Go. And they sold more than 20 million albums worldwide. They were nominated for a Grammy and became one of the most reliable arena rock acts of the 2000s and 2010s. Here's the part of Brad Arnold's story that always gets people. He was 15 years old when he wrote Kryptonite. He scribbled the lyrics during math class. A kid in Mississippi, sitting at a school desk, writing the words to what would become one of the biggest rock songs of its generation. He never could have imagined it. But that's how these things happen sometimes. The magic finds you when you're not looking. From the stage to the corridors of power. Robert Mueller, who served as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 12 years, and later became one of the most closely watched figures in American political life, died on March 20, 2026, at the age of 81. Mueller was a decorated Marine who served in Vietnam. He earned a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, among other commendations. After the war, he built a career in federal law enforcement and was nominated by President George W. Bush to head the FBI in 2001. He was confirmed by the Senate and took office on September 4, 2001, exactly 1 week before the September 11th attacks changed everything. His 12-year tenure was defined by the transformation of the Bureau from a primarily domestic law enforcement agency into a central player in the nation's counterterrorism efforts. He served under both Bush and Barack Obama. Then, in 2017, Mueller was appointed as special counsel to investigate Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. For nearly 2 years, his investigation consumed the national conversation. Mueller conducted his work with the same quiet, methodical discipline that had characterized his entire career. He rarely spoke publicly, rarely gave interviews, and when he testified before Congress, his answers were clipped and precise. Whether you agreed with his conclusions or not, Robert Mueller was widely respected as a man of principle who served his country in uniform, in law enforcement, and in one of the most politically charged investigations in modern American history. Now let's return to younger faces. James Van Der Beek, the actor who became a household name playing Dawson Leary on the WB teen drama Dawson's Creek, died on February 11, 2026. He was just 48 years old. Van Der Beek had publicly announced his diagnosis of stage 3 colorectal cancer in late 2024, and he spent his final months raising awareness about the disease and urging people to get screened early. Dawson's Creek premiered in January 1998, and it became a cultural touchstone for the entire millennial generation. Van Der Beek, with his boyish good looks and earnest, heartfelt delivery, was the center of it. A small-town kid in fictional Cape Side, Massachusetts, who dreamed of making movies and named his boat after Steven Spielberg. The show ran for 6 seasons and also launched the careers of Katie Holmes, Joshua Jackson, and Michelle Williams, all of whom went on to significant careers of their own. After the show ended, Van Der Beek surprised people by displaying sharp comedic instincts, particularly in Don't Trust the Bee in Apartment 23, where he played an exaggerated, narcissistic version of himself to great comic effect. He was a father of 6 children with his wife Kimberly, and he was characteristically open and direct about his cancer battle. The loss of James Vander Beek at 48 was a stark reminder that colorectal cancer does not wait for old age, and his advocacy in his final months may save lives for years to come. Another television favorite who was taken far too young, Eric Dane, best known to millions as Dr. Mark Sloan, McSteamy, on Grey's Anatomy, died on February 19, 2026, at the age of 53, from respiratory failure caused by ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. He had announced his diagnosis less than a year earlier, in April 2025, and the disease progressed with heartbreaking speed. Eric Dane was a San Francisco kid who worked his way up through small guest roles in the early 90s, Saved by the Bell, The Wonder Years, before landing the part that changed everything. When he walked out of a bathroom wearing nothing but a strategically placed towel on Grey's Anatomy in 2006, it was what the industry calls a water cooler moment. The character's nickname, McSteamy, stuck to Dane in real life, whether he liked it or not. He played the role for 6 seasons before his character was killed off in a plane crash, but the show honored him by renaming its fictional hospital Grey Sloan Memorial. He took on strikingly different roles after Grey's: the stoic naval captain Tom Chandler in The Last Ship, and the deeply troubled, closeted patriarch Cal Jacobs on HBO's Euphoria. After his ALS diagnosis, Dane threw himself into advocacy work. He testified before Congress about health insurance reform, received the ALS Network's Advocate of the Year award, and sat for a final interview that was included in Netflix's documentary series, Famous Last Words. "I hope I've demonstrated that you can face anything," he said. "You can face the end of your days with dignity." He also recorded a message for his 2 daughters, Billy and Georgia. "I tried," he told them. "I stumbled sometimes, but I tried. Overall, we had a blast, didn't we?" He left behind those daughters and his wife, the actress Rebecca Gayheart. Let's step away from Hollywood for a moment and into a cubicle, the most famous cubicle in American newspaper history. Scott Adams, the creator of the Dilbert comic strip, died on January 13, 2026, at the age of 68. Adams drew Dilbert while working at Pacific Bell, mining his daily experience as a mid-level office drone for comic inspiration. The strip debuted in 1989 and eventually ran in more than 1,000 newspapers across 32 countries. Dilbert, with his perpetually upturned necktie and his oblivious, pointy-haired boss, became the patron saint of frustrated cubicle workers across America. The strip inspired a television series, spawned numerous best-selling books, and became one of the most commercially successful newspaper comics of its generation. Adams had a fascinating personal story behind the cartoon. He suffered from a condition called focal dystonia that affected his ability to draw with his dominant hand. Rather than stop, he taught himself to draw with his other hand and kept the strip going for years. He was also one of the first cartoonists to put his email address in the strip, inviting readers to share their own workplace horror stories. Many of those stories became plots. In later years, Adams became a polarizing public figure through his online political commentary, but in the world of the funny pages, Dilbert's place is well secured. Now let's hear a voice that echoed across a muddy hillside in upstate New York in the summer of 1969 and has never really faded. Country Joe McDonald died on March 7, 2026, in the San Francisco Bay Area. He was 84, and his health had been declining due to Parkinson's disease. At the Woodstock Music Festival, Country Joe stood alone on a stage in front of hundreds of thousands of people and led the crowd in the famous fish cheer, a call and response using a word you definitely couldn't say on network television. Followed by his anti-Vietnam War anthem, "I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die" rag. It was one of the most electric moments of the entire festival, and one of the defining performances of the 1960s counterculture. With his band Country Joe and the Fish, he was a central figure of the San Francisco psychedelic music scene. But McDonald was far more than a one-hit protest singer. He was a thoughtful activist who devoted much of his later career to advocating for the welfare of Vietnam veterans. And here's the detail that always added a layer of complexity to his most famous song. Country Joe McDonald was himself a military veteran. He had served in the United States Navy before the war escalated. He knew the military from the inside. He once said the song wasn't anti-soldier, it was anti-war, and there was an important difference. He spent his later decades performing at veterans' events, raising money for veteran causes, and reminding people that opposing a war and supporting the people sent to fight it were not contradictory positions. From Woodstock to Hollywood, where one man made both comedy and tragedy look effortless. Rob Reiner, the actor, director, writer, and producer, was found dead along with his wife Michelle Singer Reiner in their Los Angeles home on December 14, 2025. Their deaths were ruled a homicide, and the case shocked the entertainment world and the nation. He was 78. Rob Reiner was the son of comedy legend Carl Reiner, and he built a career that would have made any parent proud, twice over. First, he became one of the most beloved figures on 70s television as Michael Meathead Stivic on All in the Family, the liberal son-in-law who sparred with Carol O'Connor's Archie Bunker across the dinner table every week. Reiner won 2 Emmy Awards for that role. Then he moved behind the camera and produced one of the most astonishing directorial runs in Hollywood history. This is Spinal Tap in 1984, which he co-wrote and appeared in. Stand By Me in 1986. The Princess Bride in 1987. When Harry Met Sally in 1989. Misery in 1990. A Few Good Men in 1992. 6 beloved films in 8 years, and not one of them is anything like the others. Each is its own world. Reiner was also an outspoken political commentator and philanthropist who used his platform to champion causes he believed in. The circumstances of his and Michelle's deaths, coming so suddenly and so violently, added a layer of tragedy to the loss that went far beyond the entertainment industry. His father, Carl Reiner, had died in 2020 at the age of 98. The two had been extraordinarily close. After something that heavy, let's cross the Atlantic to Milan, where elegance was practically an art form. Giorgio Armani, the Italian fashion designer who transformed how the modern man dresses, died on September 4, 2025, at the age of 91. If you remember the film American Gigolo from 1980, you remember the moment, Richard Gere trying on that relaxed, unstructured, single-breasted jacket. That was Armani. Before him, men's suits were stiff and boxy. After him, they draped and flowed. He founded his fashion house in Milan in 1975 and maintained personal control of the privately held company, which generated billions of dollars annually, until the very end. Unlike many designers of his stature, Armani never sold his company to a luxury conglomerate. He ran it himself, overseeing everything from the design studio to the boardroom. Growing up in an Italy ravaged by World War II, young Giorgio was fascinated by architecture and design. That structural eye informed everything he created for the rest of his life. He dressed Hollywood stars for the red carpet, dressed businessmen for the boardroom, and in doing so, he changed the way an entire culture thought about how a man should look. He was fiercely private in his personal life, but unmistakable in his aesthetic vision. From the elegance of Milan to the thundering darkness of Birmingham, England, Ozzy Osbourne, the self-proclaimed Prince of Darkness, died on July 22, 2025, at the age of 76. He had been battling Parkinson's disease for years, and complications from the condition led to his decline. Ozzy was born John Michael Osbourne in Birmingham, and together with guitarist Tony Iommi, bassist Geezer Butler, and drummer Bill Ward, he co-founded Black Sabbath in 1968, a band that is widely credited with inventing heavy metal. Paranoid, Iron Man, War Pigs. These weren't just hit songs. They were the foundation of an entire genre that would spawn thousands of bands and millions of devoted fans worldwide. Osbourne was fired from Sabbath in 1979 due to drug and alcohol abuse, and what happened next was remarkable. His solo career turned out to be even bigger. Crazy Train, with its instantly recognizable guitar riff. Mr. Crowley, Mama, I'm Coming Home. He sold more than 100 million records worldwide. And then, in 2002, came The Osbournes on MTV, a reality show that revealed Ozzy not as the Prince of Darkness, but as a shuffling, lovable, perpetually confused family man who couldn't work the television remote. It made him a pop culture icon all over again, this time for an entirely new generation. He won Grammy Awards both with Sabbath and as a solo artist, and he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, once with the band and once on his own. After his death, his daughter Kelly wrote simply that she'd lost the best friend I ever had. His wife Sharon said she was still having trouble finding the words. From the heaviest of metal to the most sublime of harmonies, Brian Wilson, the creative genius behind the Beach Boys, died in June 2025 at the age of 83. Brian Wilson didn't just write songs about surfing and California girls, though he did that brilliantly. He was a composer of staggering, almost reckless ambition. The 1966 album Pet Sounds is routinely ranked among the greatest records ever made. Paul McCartney has said repeatedly that it was the primary inspiration for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Wilson arranged every note, layering harmonies and orchestral instruments in ways nobody in pop music had attempted before. The album was a commercial disappointment at first, which devastated Wilson. He had poured everything he had into it, but ambition came at a terrible cost. Wilson suffered from serious mental health issues throughout his life, including auditory hallucinations. He heard voices that tormented him. He spent much of the 70s and 80s in a fragile, reclusive state, for a time under the controversial control of therapist Eugene Landy, who was eventually stripped of his license. Wilson's gradual return to public life and touring in the late 90s and beyond was one of the most moving comeback stories in all of music. When the Beach Boys sang God Only Knows, it was Brian's voice, Brian's arrangement, Brian's heart offered up without protection. McCartney once called it the greatest song ever written. It might well be. Now for something darker, stranger, and more beautiful than anything else on tonight's tour. David Lynch, the filmmaker who gave the world Blue Velvet, Twin Peaks, and Mulholland Drive, died on January 15, 2025, at the age of 78. He had been living with emphysema, the result of decades of heavy smoking. Lynch grew up in small-town America, Missoula, Montana, Boise, Idaho, Alexandria, Virginia, and something about the contrast between those clean, sunlit surfaces and whatever might be crawling underneath them became the driving obsession of his work. Blue Velvet in 1986 peeled back the manicured lawns of a picture-perfect American town to reveal a nightmare. Twin Peaks, which premiered on ABC in 1990, asked the question, who killed Laura Palmer? And then led viewers on the strangest, most unsettling, most achingly beautiful journey in the history of network television. It changed what was possible on the small screen. Nothing had ever looked or felt like Twin Peaks before, and every prestige television drama that came after it, from The Sopranos to True Detective, owes something to what Lynch accomplished. He won the Palme d'Or at Cannes for Wild at Heart, received 3 Academy Award nominations for directing, and was given an honorary Oscar in 2019. He was also a painter, a furniture maker, a committed practitioner of transcendental meditation, and an enthusiast of coffee and donuts to a degree that bordered on the philosophical. I learned that just beneath the surface there's another world, he once said, and still different worlds as you dig deeper. He spent a lifetime digging. From the surreal to the swashbuckling. Val Kilmer died on April 1, 2025, at the age of 65, from pneumonia. He had been battling throat cancer since 2014, a disease that had severely diminished his famous voice but never his spirit. For a blazing stretch in the late 1980s and 1990s, Val Kilmer was one of the most electrifying actors in Hollywood. He was Iceman in Top Gun, all swagger and barely concealed competitiveness. He was Jim Morrison in Oliver Stone's The Doors, disappearing so completely into the role that surviving members of the band found it uncanny. He was Doc Holliday in Tombstone, delivering the line, "I'm your Huckleberry," with such dry, lethal charm that it became one of the most quoted lines in movie history. And he was Batman in Batman Forever, though he'd probably prefer you remembered the other ones. Kilmer was Juilliard-trained, fiercely intelligent, and famously demanding on sets. Directors either loved working with him or vowed never to do it again. But every frame of film he appeared in crackled with life. His battle with throat cancer and the resulting loss of his voice was one of the most poignant stories in modern Hollywood. A 2021 documentary called Val, assembled from decades of home video that Kilmer had been compulsively recording since he was a teenager, gave audiences an intimate, heartbreaking look at his life, his craft, and his courage. His daughter Mercedes announced his passing. Let's hear a very different kind of music. Sly Stone, born Sylvester Stewart in Denton, Texas, raised in Vallejo, California, died on June 9, 2025, at the age of 82, from pulmonary disease. With Sly and the family Stone, he fused rock, soul, funk, and psychedelia into something the world had never heard before. Everyday people. Dance to the music. Thank you for letting me be myself again. Hot fun in the summertime. Family affair. These songs didn't just top the charts, they broke barriers. The Family Stone was one of the first major bands to be fully integrated by both race and gender, with black and white members, men and women, all playing and singing together on the same stage. Their blistering performance at Woodstock in 1969 was one of the festival's defining moments. But Sly Stone's later decades were marked by drug addiction, erratic behavior, reclusiveness, and financial hardship. For a period, he was reportedly living out of a camper van on the streets of Los Angeles. His story is one of extraordinary genius, transformative cultural influence, and enormous personal pain, all bound up in the same remarkable life. Every funk, R&B, and hip-hop artist who came after him owes something to what Sly Stone created. He changed the sound of America, even as America sometimes forgot about him. From the concert stage to the theatrical stage, the great British playwright Tom Stoppard died on November 29, 2025, at the age of 88. If you've ever seen Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, you know Tom Stoppard's particular genius. He plucked two insignificant characters from Shakespeare's Hamlet, put them at center stage, and wrote a play that managed to be simultaneously hilarious, disorienting, and philosophically profound. Stoppard was a 5-time Tony Award winner for plays including The Real Thing, The Coast of Utopia, and his late-career masterpiece Leopoldstadt, a deeply personal work about a Jewish family in Vienna across the 20th century. He won an Academy Award for co-writing the screenplay for Shakespeare in Love. Born Thomas Straussler in Czechoslovakia in 1937, Stoppard's family fled the Nazis when he was a child. His mother remarried a British Army officer named Stoppard, and the family settled in England, where young Tom became one of the most celebrated writers the English language has ever produced. He was knighted in 1997. Even in his 80s, he continued to write plays that challenged, delighted, and moved audiences around the world. From the refined world of the theater to the ropes and turnbuckles of the wrestling ring, Hulk Hogan, born Terry Jean Bollea in Tampa, Florida, died on July 24, 2025, at the age of 71, from cardiac arrest following recent surgery. For a solid decade in the 1980s and into the 90s, Hulk Hogan was the most famous professional wrestler on the planet. With his handlebar mustache, his red and yellow bandana, his massive biceps, the 24-inch pythons, and his signature atomic leg drop finishing move, Hogan turned the World Wrestling Federation into a mainstream entertainment juggernaut. WrestleMania, which launched in 1985, was essentially built around him. He headlined the first 9 WrestleMania events and became a crossover celebrity, starring in films and having his own reality show, Hogan Knows Best, in the mid-2000s. His catchphrase, "What you gonna do, brother, when Hulkamania runs wild on you?" was known by virtually every kid in America. Later in his career, Hogan reinvented himself as the villainous Hollywood Hogan in WCW's New World Order storyline, one of the most successful and shocking angles in professional wrestling history. That heel turn at Bash at the Beach in 1996, when he turned on the fans who had cheered him for a decade, is still talked about as one of the most jaw-dropping moments in wrestling. He was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2005. Off the stage, Hogan was a complicated and sometimes controversial figure whose personal life and public disputes sometimes overshadowed his in-ring legacy. But inside the squared circle, he was undeniably one of the most important performers the industry ever produced. He also appeared alongside Sylvester Stallone in Rocky III as the Towering Thunder Lips. Professional wrestling simply doesn't look the way it does today without Hulk Hogan. From the spectacle of the ring to the quiet of the African bush, Jane Goodall, the world's foremost primatologist and one of the most admired scientists of the 20th century, died on October 1, 2025, at the age of 91. Jane Goodall traveled to Tanzania in 1960 at the age of 26, with no university degree, no formal scientific training, just a notebook, binoculars, and an unbreakable curiosity about chimpanzees. She had been hired by the paleontologist Louis Leakey, who believed that a patient, open-minded observer could learn things about primates that credentialed scientists had missed. He was right. Goodall was the first person to observe chimpanzees making and using tools, stripping leaves from twigs to fish for termites, a discovery that shattered the assumption that tool use was uniquely human. It forced the scientific establishment to rethink the very definition of what separated humans from animals. Over the decades that followed, Goodall became the world's most recognized advocate for wildlife conservation and environmental stewardship. She founded the Jane Goodall Institute, received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, was named a United Nations Messenger of Peace, and spent the last 30 years of her life traveling more than 300 days a year, giving lectures and inspiring young people to care about the planet. She lived long enough to see an entire generation of conservationists cite her as the reason they entered the field. "What you do makes a difference," she once said, "and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make." Let's return now to the movies for one of the great cult classics. Bud Cort, who personified the role of Harold in the 1971 Hal Ashby film Harold and Maude, died on February 11, 2026, in Connecticut, after a long illness. He was 77. Harold and Maude is one of those films that didn't find its audience right away. When it was first released, critics didn't know what to make of it, and neither did audiences. A dark comedy about a death-obsessed young man from a wealthy family who stages elaborate fake suicides for attention, and then falls in love with a 79-year-old free-spirited woman played by Ruth Gordon. It sounded bizarre. It was bizarre. But over the years, it became a cult classic of the highest order, the kind of film that college students discovered on late-night television and then pressed upon their friends like a secret handshake. Cat Stevens wrote the soundtrack, and the songs became inseparable from the film's gentle, bittersweet spirit. Bud Cort's performance as Harold, pale, deadpan, impossibly earnest in his morbidity, was unforgettable. He went on to work with Robert Altman and appeared in dozens of other film and television projects over the decades, but Harold was the role that defined him. He once said he didn't mind being known for one thing because it was a very good thing to be known for. Now an actress whose career spanned 6 decades and whose family name was Hollywood royalty. Diane Ladd, a 3-time Academy Award nominee, died on November 3, 2025, at her home in Ojai, California. She was 89. Her daughter, the actress Laura Dern, was at her side. Ladd earned those 3 Oscar nominations for Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore in 1974, Wild at Heart in 1990, and Rambling Rose in 1991. In both Wild at Heart and Rambling Rose, she appeared alongside her own daughter, Laura Dern, making them one of the most celebrated mother-daughter acting partnerships in film history. In Rambling Rose, both Ladd and Dern were nominated for Oscars for the same film, only the second time a parent and child had been nominated together. Beyond those signature roles, Ladd appeared in Chinatown, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, and dozens of other films and television productions over a remarkably long career. She was also a painter, a writer, and an activist for environmental causes. Her death came from respiratory failure, and Laura Dern's tribute to her mother called her "my amazing hero and the most profound gift of my life." Let's travel, at least in spirit, to the island of Jamaica and remember a man whose music carried the spirit of that place to every corner of the world. Jimmy Cliff, the reggae legend, died on November 24, 2025, at the age of 81. Jimmy Cliff was born during a hurricane in St. James, Jamaica, in 1944, a dramatic entrance for a man whose life would be defined by creative force. He had his first hit record at 14 and by his mid-20s was an international star. He wrote and starred in the 1972 film The Harder They Come, which introduced reggae music to audiences far beyond Jamaica in a way that nothing had done before. The film's soundtrack, featuring You Can Get It If You Really Want, Many Rivers to Cross, and the title track, became essential listening for a generation of music fans. Cliff won 2 Grammy Awards in 1986 and 2013 and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2010, only the second reggae artist to receive that honor after Bob Marley. Cliff's influence went far beyond chart positions. His music was covered and admired by artists across every genre. Bruce Springsteen recorded Trapped, and the song became a concert staple. Jimmy Cliff once said, "Music is the biggest weapon in the world," and he wielded his with joy and righteous conviction for more than 50 years. From the warmth of Caribbean music to the cool glamour of the French Riviera, Brigitte Bardot, the actress, international sex symbol, and later animal rights campaigner, died on December 28, 2025, at the age of 91. In the 1950s and 1960s, Brigitte Bardot was arguably the most photographed woman in the world. Her role in Roger Vadim's And God Created Woman in 1956 scandalized and captivated audiences in equal measure, turning her into a global icon of beauty and sensuality. She appeared in nearly 50 films, including The Truth and Viva Maria, and was a subject of tabloid fascination on both sides of the Atlantic for decades. Her image graced magazine covers around the world, and her casual, sun-kissed style influenced fashion for generations. But here's the turn in Bardot's story that surprised everyone. At the height of her fame, in 1973, at just 38 years old, she walked away from the film industry entirely. She was done with acting, done with the cameras, done with being looked at. She founded the Brigitte Bardot Foundation for the welfare and protection of animals and devoted the rest of her life to animal welfare, becoming one of the most prominent, and sometimes controversial, voices in the world on behalf of animal rights. She spent her final decades in relative seclusion in the south of France, living quietly with her animals, having traded one kind of fame for another kind of purpose. Back in America now, let's remember a man whose smooth, handsome face graced the cover of every TV guide in the 1960s. Richard Chamberlain, the actor often called the first true television heartthrob, died on March 29, 2025, at the age of 90. Chamberlain became a household name as the young Dr. James Kildare on the NBC medical drama Dr. Kildare, which ran from 1961 to 1966. The fan mail was enormous. Thousands of letters a week, many of them from lovesick young women who wanted to marry him. And he was marketed relentlessly as a teen idol, complete with a pop music career that yielded a top 20 hit, a cover of 3 Stars Will Shine Tonight, the show's theme song. But Chamberlain had ambitions that the teen idol machinery couldn't contain. After Kildare ended, he went to England to do serious classical theater work, Shakespeare, Ibsen, Chekhov, and reinvented himself completely. Then, in the late 70s and 80s, came the era that defined his career. Richard Chamberlain became the undisputed king of the television miniseries, those lavish, multi-night events that drew massive audiences in the days before streaming, when the whole country watched the same show at the same time. He starred in Shogun, playing an English navigator stranded in feudal Japan, a performance that required him to learn elements of the Japanese language and immerse himself in samurai culture. The miniseries was based on James Clavell's best-selling novel and was watched by over 130 million viewers. He followed it with The Thornbirds, playing the conflicted Catholic priest, Father Ralph de Bricassar, torn between his vows to the church and his passionate love for a woman played by Rachel Ward. The Thornbirds was watched by more than 100 million people across its 4 nights and remains one of the highest-rated miniseries in television history. Later in life, Chamberlain publicly came out as gay in his 2003 memoir, Shattered Love. He was one of the first major Hollywood leading men of his generation to do so. He reflected honestly on the decades of hiding that had cost him, personally and professionally, and on the freedom and peace that came with finally telling the truth. He continued acting on stage and screen into his 80s, and he remained a gracious presence at fan conventions and public appearances. A voice like nothing else in popular music. Roberta Flack, the singer and pianist whose sound was as warm and enveloping as a blanket on a winter night, died on February 24, 2025, at the age of 88. Roberta Flack achieved something no one had done before. She won the Grammy Award for Record of the Year 2 years in a row. First for The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face in 1973, then for Killing Me Softly with His Song in 1974. Both recordings were characterized by Flack's extraordinary restraint. She never oversang, never pushed too hard, and the result was music of devastating emotional intimacy. She also won a Grammy for Where Is the Love, her duet with the late Donny Hathaway, a musical partner whose own tragic death haunted her for years. Flack was a classically trained pianist who earned a music scholarship to Howard University at the age of 15, the youngest student the school had ever admitted to its music program. After graduating, she briefly taught music before being discovered performing in a Washington, D.C. nightclub by the musician Les McCann, who was so moved by her performance that he reportedly told everyone within earshot they had to come hear this woman. In her later years, Flack was diagnosed with ALS, which gradually robbed her of the ability to sing and eventually to speak, an unspeakably cruel fate for someone whose voice was her greatest gift. She received the Recording Academy's Lifetime Achievement Award and was honored at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington. Let's hear a different sound, something bright and sunny that you've probably heard in an elevator and couldn't get out of your head for a week. Chuck Mangione, the jazz flugelhorn player whose instrumental Feels So Good became one of the most ubiquitous melodies of 1978, died on July 22, 2025, at the age of 85. That melody, warm, expansive, with a groove that made you feel like summer was never going to end, earned Mangione a Grammy Award for Best Pop Instrumental Performance. But Mangione was a serious jazz musician long before that crossover hit. He grew up in Rochester, New York, in a musical Italian-American family, studied at the Eastman School of Music, and performed with Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers before launching his solo career. He released more than 30 albums over the course of his career. And here's a detail that a whole younger generation will appreciate. A character clearly modeled on Chuck Mangione appeared as a recurring figure on the animated series King of the Hill. The character attended community events, always with his flugelhorn, and Mangione reportedly loved the tribute. It introduced him to millions of fans who had never heard Feels So Good on the radio the first time around. From the easy groove of jazz to the hard-charging world of American politics. Dick Cheney, the 46th Vice President of the United States under George W. Bush, died in 2025 at the age of 84. Cheney was, by many accounts, the most powerful vice president in American history. Before serving alongside Bush from 2001 to 2009, he had already held some of the most consequential positions in the federal government. He was White House Chief of Staff under Gerald Ford at the remarkably young age of 34. He represented Wyoming in the United States House of Representatives for 5 terms, and he served as Secretary of Defense under the first President Bush during the Gulf War. His vice presidency was defined by the September 11th attacks and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that followed. He was a driving force behind the administration's approach to the war on terror, including the use of enhanced interrogation techniques that sparked fierce debate and condemnation. Cheney was a deeply polarizing figure, admired by supporters for his decisiveness, strategic thinking, and steady hand during a moment of national crisis, and condemned by critics for what they saw as an overreach of executive power and the expansion of warrantless surveillance programs. He was, by any measure, a man who wielded enormous influence behind the scenes of American government for nearly 4 decades. In his personal life, Cheney survived 5 heart attacks over the course of several decades, the first one striking at just 37 years of age, and he received a heart transplant in 2012 at the age of 71. He later joked that he'd lived for 20 months without a pulse while waiting for the transplant, thanks to a left ventricular assist device that kept his blood flowing continuously rather than in beats. He was a devoted fly fisherman and spent much of his later years in Wyoming, the state he'd once represented in Congress. In 2024, in a move that surprised many, Cheney publicly endorsed a Democratic presidential candidate, citing concerns about the direction of his own party. Whatever your politics, the scope of Dick Cheney's influence on American governance was enormous and undeniable. Now a figure from the world of documentary filmmaking whose name most people don't know, but whose influence on the art form was immeasurable. Frederick Wiseman, the great American documentarian, died on February 16, 2026, at the age of 96. Starting with Titicut Follies in 1967, a searing, unflinching look inside a Massachusetts state institution for the criminally insane that was actually banned from public showing for over 20 years due to privacy concerns. Wiseman spent nearly 6 decades making films about American institutions: hospitals, high schools, welfare offices, police departments, ballet companies, public housing projects, monasteries, meat processing plants, a department store, the Paris Opera, a public library in New York, a small town in rural Maine. He made over 40 feature-length documentaries, and every single one shared the same revolutionary approach. No narration, no interviews, no music, no title cards explaining what you're watching. Just the camera, pointed at the way things actually worked, and the audience left entirely to draw their own conclusions. Critics called it observational cinema or direct cinema, and nobody practiced it with more discipline, more patience, or more intellectual rigor than Frederick Wiseman. He received an honorary Academy Award in 2016, and he was still actively working into his 90s. His final film, Menu Plaisir, Les Trois Gros, about a legendary 3-star French restaurant and the family that runs it, premiered at the Venice Film Festival when Wiseman was 93 years old. The film ran 4 hours long. He once said, "I try to find out what's really going on." For 60 years, that's exactly what he did. Most people outside the film world don't know his name, but among documentary filmmakers and cinema scholars, Frederick Wiseman was considered one of the greatest artists the medium has ever produced. Let's remember a singer whose voice defined an era and whose story was marked by both extraordinary triumph and deep pain. Connie Francis, one of the biggest-selling female artists of the late 1950s and early 1960s, died in July 2025 at the age of 87. The hits came fast and dazzling. "Who's Sorry Now?" which her father had urged her to record, even though she thought it was old-fashioned. "Stupid Cupid," written for her by Neil Sedaka and Howard Greenfield, whom we visited earlier on this tour. "Lipstick on Your Collar," "Where the Boys Are," which became the theme for the 1960 film of the same name. "My Heart Has a Mind of Its Own," "Everybody's Somebody's Fool." Connie Francis sold more than 100 million records worldwide, making her one of the best-selling female vocalists in history. She recorded in over a dozen languages, including Italian, Spanish, German, and Japanese, reaching audiences around the world that most American pop singers of her era couldn't touch. She was the first woman to have a #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100 chart with Everybody's Somebody's Fool in 1960. But Francis's life off the stage was scarred by tragedy. In 1974, after performing a concert at the Westbury Music Fair on Long Island, she was the victim of a brutal assault in her motel room, an attack that left deep emotional and psychological wounds that haunted her for the rest of her life. She battled depression, post-traumatic stress, and the lasting effects of the assault for years. She sued the Howard Johnson's motel chain where the attack occurred, winning a landmark $3 million judgment that led to improved security standards in hotels and motels across the country. The case changed the hospitality industry. Despite everything she endured, Connie Francis kept performing and recording. She was sustained by the devotion of her fans and by a personal resilience that was, in its own way, as remarkable as her voice. Her story is one of triumph and tragedy in measures that few lives contain. Now an actress of enormous emotional intensity who moved fearlessly between mainstream Hollywood and the fringes of independent film. Sally Kirkland, who earned an Academy Award nomination for the 1987 film Anna, died on November 11, 2025 in Palm Springs. She was 83. Kirkland had been acting since the 1960s, and her film credits read like a tour through several decades of American cinema. She appeared in The Sting with Robert Redford and Paul Newman. That's two people we've already visited on this tour. And in The Way We Were and Private Benjamin. But the role that brought her the most acclaim was in the independent film Anna, in which she played a once-celebrated Czech actress trying to rebuild her life and career in New York City. It was a performance of raw, unguarded emotion that earned her a Golden Globe Award for Best Actress and that Oscar nomination. Kirkland was also an ordained minister, a devoted practitioner of yoga, and a generous mentor to younger actors and filmmakers. She lived her life with the same openness and lack of pretension that she brought to her best work. From one Oscar-nominated performance to the darkest corners of the screen, Tom Noonan, the towering character actor whose 6'5" frame and intense, unsettling presence made him one of Hollywood's most memorable screen villains, died on February 14, 2026, at the age of 74. You might not know Tom Noonan's name, but if you've seen the right movies, you will never forget his face. He played the serial killer Francis Dollarhide, the Tooth Fairy, in Michael Mann's 1986 thriller Manhunter, the first film based on Thomas Harris's Red Dragon novels. It was a performance of terrifying interiority. Noonan made the character pitiable as much as frightening, and the film is now considered a classic of the genre. He was the menacing Kane in RoboCop 2, and he gave an extraordinary, deeply empathetic performance as himself, or a version of himself, in Charlie Kaufman's mind-bending Synecdoche, New York. Noonan was also a playwright and theater director who ran his own company in New York. He once said he was drawn to playing villains because they were the most human characters, the ones who let you see the full range of what people were capable of. Now a name from a Hollywood dynasty. Robert Carradine, the youngest brother in the Carradine acting family, died on February 23, 2026, at the age of 71. He had battled bipolar disorder for nearly 2 decades. Robert was the half-brother of David and Keith Carradine, continuing one of the longest-running family traditions in the entertainment industry. Their father was the legendary character actor John Carradine, who appeared in over 200 films, including The Grapes of Wrath and Stagecoach. The Carradines were Hollywood royalty in the truest sense, though theirs was a complicated, sometimes turbulent kingdom. Robert's breakout role came in 1984 with Revenge of the Nerds, in which he played Louis Skolnick, the bespectacled, lovably determined head of the Lambda 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 fraternity. The movie became a cult classic and spawned 3 sequels. But Robert had been a working actor long before the Nerds came calling. As a teenager, he appeared alongside John Wayne in The Cowboys in 1972, and he later starred in Samuel Fuller's acclaimed World War II film The Big Red One opposite Lee Marvin, a role that showed his range far beyond comedy. He also appeared in the coming-of-age TV film Revenge of the Nerds and its sequels, and had parts in films like the Lizzie McGuire movie and Django Unchained. His career stretched across 5 decades, moving fluidly between drama, comedy, and genre work. His struggle with bipolar disorder was something he dealt with privately for many years. From one Hollywood family to the idealized one, Lauren Chapin, beloved as Kathy Kitten Anderson on the classic 1950s television series Father Knows Best, died on February 24, 2026, following a battle with cancer. she was 80. Father Knows Best ran from 1954 to 1960 and depicted an idealized American family. Wise father, patient mother, 3 well-adjusted children, in a way that became the template for decades of family sitcoms that followed. Robert Young played the patriarch Jim Anderson, and the show won multiple Emmy Awards during its run. Chapin was just 9 years old when the show began, and her character, the youngest Anderson daughter, was adored by audiences. Every week, Kitten got into some small scrape and her father dispensed gentle wisdom, and America watched and smiled. But Chapin's real life after the show ended was anything but the picture of domestic harmony the Andersons represented. She has spoken publicly about a difficult childhood behind the scenes, about struggles with drug addiction that began in her teenage years, and about a series of painful personal circumstances that dogged her for 2 decades after the show ended. She eventually found stability and peace through her Christian faith, becoming an ordained minister. She spent her later years speaking openly about her journey, appearing at fan conventions and churches alike, offering hope to others facing similar battles. She was living proof that the road from rock bottom to redemption was a real one. The contrast between the wholesome world of Father Knows Best and the reality of Lauren Chapin's life told a larger story, about the gap between television fantasy and real life in mid-century America, and about the particular pressures placed on child actors long before anyone thought to protect them. Glamour and grit, all wrapped up in one fearless performer. Valerie Perrine, the actress who won Best Actress at the Cannes Film Festival for the 1974 film Lenny, died on March 23, 2026, at the age of 82. Before she was an actress, Perrine was a Las Vegas showgirl. She danced at the Lido de Paris at the Stardust Hotel. And she brought that bold, uninhibited energy to every role she played. Her performance as Honey Bruce in the Lenny Bruce biopic Lenny, directed by Bob Fosse and co-starring Dustin Hoffman in the title role, earned her not only the Cannes Award, but also an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. It was a performance of raw vulnerability that showed audiences a side of Lenny Bruce's story they hadn't seen before. She then pivoted to blockbuster entertainment, playing Eve Teschmacher, Lex Luthor's long-suffering, ultimately conscience-stricken girlfriend in the original Superman film and its sequel, Superman II, alongside Christopher Reeve and Gene Hackman. We visited Hackman earlier tonight. Perrine also appeared in films like W.C. Fields and Me and the Border, working steadily through the 80s before stepping back from the industry. In her later years, she lived with Parkinson's disease, which eventually required her to use a wheelchair. She faced her illness with the same directness and lack of self-pity she had always brought to the screen. Her Connie's win remains one of the highlights of American independent cinema in the 70s. From the silver screen to the mosh pit. Phil Campbell, the guitarist who played with the legendary British rock band Motorhead for over 30 years, died on March 13, 2026, at the age of 64, following a long battle in intensive care after complications from a major operation. Campbell was a Welshman from Pontypridd who joined Motorhead in 1984 and stayed with the band through thick and thin until it disbanded in 2015, following the death of frontman Lemmy Kilmister. For 3 decades, Campbell's guitar was an essential part of that unmistakable thunderous sound, a wall of distortion and power that made Motorhead one of the most influential bands in rock history. Ace of Spades, Overkill, Killed by Death, Born to Raise Hell. The band was too loud, too fast, and too uncompromising for polite society, and they liked it that way. Lemmy once said that if Motorhead moved in next door, your lawn would die. Campbell was the guitarist who kept that chaos musical. After Lemmy died on December 28, 2015, just 4 days after being diagnosed with an extremely aggressive cancer, the band ended. But Campbell wasn't ready to stop. He formed a new band with his own sons called Phil Campbell and the Bastard Sons, keeping the spirit alive and the amplifiers cranked. They released multiple albums and toured extensively. His children announced his passing on social media, saying their father had fought a long and courageous battle in intensive care after a complex major operation. He was 64, younger than many of the performers on tonight's tour. A reminder that rock and roll doesn't always let you grow old gracefully. Now a fairy tale story from the world of rock and roll, one that sounds too good to be true, and yet it was. Tommy DiCarlo, who became the lead vocalist of the arena rock band Boston in one of the most improbable career stories in music history, died on March 9, 2026, at the age of 60, after a battle with brain cancer. Here's the story. Tommy DiCarlo was working as a credit analyst at a Home Depot call center in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was 40 years old, married, with kids. In his spare time, he posted covers of Boston songs on MySpace, the social network that existed before Facebook took over the world. His voice was so uncannily similar to original Boston vocalist Brad Delp, who had taken his own life in 2007, that the recordings caught the attention of Tom Scholz, Boston's perfectionist founder and chief songwriter. Scholz was famously exacting. He'd spent years crafting the band's debut album in his basement studio, layering guitar tracks with almost obsessive precision. If anyone could tell the difference between a real Boston voice and a pretender, it was Tom Scholz. He invited DiCarlo to audition. DiCarlo got the job. Just like that. From a cubicle and a telephone headset to arena stages and stadium sound systems singing More Than a Feeling and Don't Look Back and Peace of Mind in front of thousands of screaming fans who had waited decades to hear those songs performed live again. Boston had sold over 75 million records worldwide, and their debut album remains one of the best-selling first albums in history. And now its songs were being sung by a guy from a Home Depot call center. It was the kind of American dream story that songwriters dream of writing. DiCarlo toured with Boston for nearly 2 decades, and by all accounts he never took a single moment of it for granted. He understood exactly how improbable his life had become, and he was grateful every day for it. Now we turn to a young actor who grew up in front of the entire country. Malcolm-Jamal Warner, who played Theo Huxtable on The Cosby Show, drowned while on vacation with his family in Costa Rica on July 20th, 2025. He was 54 years old. Warner was just 14 when The Cosby Show premiered in 1984, and he quite literally grew up on camera, from an awkward teenager to a young adult, over the show's 8-season run. The Cosby Show was a cultural phenomenon of a kind that is almost impossible to imagine today. The #1 rated show on American television for 5 consecutive seasons, watched by tens of millions of families every Thursday night. Its depiction of an affluent, well-educated African-American family, Cliff the obstetrician, Claire the attorney, and their 5 children navigating the ordinary joys and frustrations of family life, had a profound and lasting impact on how Black families were represented in popular culture. Warner's Theo was the lovable underachiever of the family, the kid who would rather play basketball than study for an exam, and his arc over the show's 8 seasons, from wayward teen to responsible young man, became one of the most watched coming-of-age stories on television. After the show ended in 1992, Warner continued to work steadily in Hollywood, both in front of and behind the camera. He appeared in the sitcom Malcolm and Eddie and the BET series Read Between the Lines, directed episodes of numerous television series including NYPD Blue and Dexter, and pursued a serious passion for music, performing as a spoken word and jazz bass artist. He earned an Emmy nomination and was widely respected in the industry as both a talented performer and a generous colleague. His sudden death at 54 while on a family vacation stunned the entertainment world and prompted an outpouring of grief from former castmates, collaborators, and fans who had grown up watching him. Let's stay with television for a moment and remember an actor whose single, drawn-out delivery of a certain word became one of the most quoted moments in modern TV history: Isiah Whitlock Jr., the character actor beloved for his roles on 2 of the greatest television dramas ever made, The Wire and Veep, died on December 30th, 2025, at the age of 71. On David Simon's The Wire, widely considered one of the greatest television dramas ever produced, Whitlock played the corrupt, smooth-talking Maryland State Senator Clay Davis. The character was a masterwork of political satire, a man who could steal from his own constituents while making them feel like he was doing them a favor. And Whitlock's signature moment, his extended, multi-syllable, operatically drawn-out delivery of a particular expletive, which he stretched to absurd, almost musical lengths, became the single most imitated and parodied catchphrase in the entire show. And that is saying something, because The Wire produced more quotable dialogue than any drama of its era. On Veep, Julia Louis-Dreyfus's HBO political satire, Whitlock brought entirely different comic gifts to the role of yet another political operator, demonstrating remarkable range. He also appeared in several Spike Lee films, including 25th Hour and Chi-Raq, and built a long-respected career on stage and in independent cinema. He appeared in the Coen brothers film Cedar Rapids, and he did voice work in animated shows. Whitlock was one of those actors who elevated every single project he touched. He never needed the leading role. He just needed one good scene and a few seconds of screen time, and the audience remembered him long after the credits rolled. Now a face you'll recognize, even if you don't know the name. Jennifer Runyon, best remembered for her brief but unforgettable appearance in the opening scene of the original 1984 Ghostbusters, died on March 6, 2026, at the age of 65, following a 6-month battle with cancer. Here's the scene. Bill Murray, as Peter Venkman, is conducting a transparently rigged ESP experiment in a university laboratory. He has 2 students sitting across from him, a nervous young man and a pretty young woman. Every time the young man guesses a card wrong, Murray shocks him. Every time the young woman guesses wrong, Murray tells her she's right and smiles. The young woman was Jennifer Runyon, and she played the scene with such natural, amused charm that she became one of the most remembered faces in a movie full of memorable faces, and she was only on screen for about 3 minutes. It's one of the most perfectly comic openings in movie history, setting up Bill Murray's character in a single, efficient, hilarious scene. Runyon went on to have a solid career in 80s television. She played Gwendolyn Pierce on Charles in Charge alongside Scott Baio, and she appeared in episodes of A Man Called Hawk, Quantum Leap, and numerous other shows. She also had roles in the films 18 Again and Carnosaur. In her later years, she stepped away from the industry to focus on family life. Her family confirmed that she was surrounded by those who loved her most when she passed. Sometimes the smallest roles leave the biggest impressions, and Jennifer Runyon's 3 minutes in Ghostbusters are proof of that. From the Sunnydale Hellmouth to a quieter place. Nicholas Brendon, the actor who played Xander Harris on the beloved series Buffy the Vampire Slayer, died in his sleep on March 20, 2026 of natural causes, according to his family. He was 54. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, created by Joss Whedon, premiered in 1997 and ran for 7 seasons on the WB and later UPN. It became one of the most critically acclaimed and passionately followed television series of its era, blending supernatural horror with sharp humor, emotional depth, and a feminist sensibility that was ahead of its time. At the heart of it all was the Scooby Gang, Buffy and her circle of friends who helped her fight the forces of evil. And Xander Harris was the beating heart of that group. He was the regular guy, the one without superpowers or mystical abilities or even exceptional academic talents who showed up every single week anyway, armed with nothing but loyalty, a self-deprecating sense of humor, and an occasional well-timed quip that cut the tension at just the right moment. Brendon played the role for all 7 seasons, and Xander became one of the most beloved characters in 90s genre television. The everyman in a world of superheroes and demons, proof that you didn't need special powers to matter. In his personal life, Brendon was open about his struggles with addiction, anxiety, and depression. He had an identical twin brother, Kelly Donovan, who occasionally served as his body double on the show. In his later years, Brendon's family said he had found renewed creative energy in painting and visual art, a passion he shared enthusiastically with friends and fans. They asked for privacy in their grief, celebrating the life of a man who lived with intensity, imagination, and heart. And for our final stop tonight, let's step across the Atlantic one last time and remember a voice that was broken by life and made all the more beautiful for it. Marianne Faithfull died on January 30th, 2025 in London. She was 78. Marianne Faithfull was discovered at a Rolling Stones party in 1964 by the band's manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, who spotted her across the room and asked if she could sing. She could. Her recording of As Tears Go By, written by a young Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, reached the top 10 in Britain and made her an overnight star of the British invasion at the age of 17. She became Jagger's girlfriend and one of the defining faces of the swinging 60s, all angelic cheekbones and flowing blonde hair, the very picture of youthful beauty. She followed that first hit with 2 albums in 1965, appeared in films alongside Alain Delon, and seemed destined for an effortless life at the top of the pop world. Then the 70s came, and they nearly killed her. Heroin addiction, homelessness, anorexia. She was sleeping on the streets of Soho in London, and everyone who had known her in the glamorous years assumed she was finished. Another cautionary tale of the 60s, burned up and discarded. But Marianne Faithfull refused to disappear. In 1979, she returned with the album Broken English, and the voice that came out of the speakers was something no one had ever heard before. It wasn't the sweet, crystalline soprano of her teenage years. It was a ravaged, gravelly, emotionally devastating instrument, forged in the furnace of everything she had survived. The album was nominated for a Grammy and is considered one of the greatest artistic comebacks in the history of popular music. The title track, with its raw, confrontational energy, sounded like nothing else on the radio in 1979. Faithfull continued recording and performing for another 4 decades, producing more than 20 albums and collaborating with artists as diverse as Nick Cave, Metallica, Roger Waters, and Beck. She co-wrote the Rolling Stones' haunting Sister Morphine, a song about addiction that drew directly from her own experience. She acted on film, on television, and on the stage. She survived breast cancer, hepatitis C, and a severe case of COVID-19 in 2020 that left her hospitalized and struggling with long-term breathing difficulties that would affect her for the rest of her life. Through it all, she remained the living, breathing proof that a voice can be broken and remade, that what the world calls damage can become the raw material of extraordinary art. She was one of those rare people who lived enough for several lifetimes and still, somehow, had more to give. Her father had worked for British intelligence. Her mother was a Viennese baroness. And Marianne herself became something no one could have predicted, a survivor whose story was written in the grain of her voice. Mick Jagger posted a tribute after her death. He wrote, "She was so much part of my life for so long. She was a wonderful friend, a beautiful singer, and a great actress. She will always be remembered." And that, friends, is our journey. 50 people, 50 stories, 50 lives that touched millions. We've walked with actors and activists, singers and scientists, comedians and coaches, designers and directors, wrestlers and writers, filmmakers and football legends. We started in the Green Hills of Virginia with Robert Duvall, the quiet craftsman who made restraint look like the most powerful thing an actor could do. And we end in London with Marianne Faithfull, who proved that a broken voice can be the most beautiful sound in the world. Along the way, we visited Oscar winners and Grammy winners, a vice president and a civil rights icon, the man who created Dilbert, and the man who created Sundance. We heard about a kid in Mississippi who wrote a hit rock song during math class, and a credit analyst who sang his way from a call center to an arena stage. We met the woman who brought chimpanzees and humans closer together, and the woman who brought Home Alone and Schitt's Creek into our living rooms. We visited the resting places of people who fought wars, and people who protested them, people who made us laugh until our sides hurt, and people who made us think until our heads did. Every one of these 50 people was alive in our time. They weren't ancient history. They were sharing the same world we share, watching the same sunsets, reading the same headlines, worrying about the same things the rest of us worry about. And now they're gone. The world is a little quieter for their absence, and a great deal richer for everything they left behind. Thank you for spending this evening with us. Rest well, every one of them, and rest well, all of you. Good night.